Donc, je suis ravi de présenter Thomas Fuchs, qui est ici présent, professeur Karl Jasper de philosophie et de psychiatrie à l'université de Heidelberg en Allemagne. Donc, nous avons un temps ensuite de 20 minutes avec des questions posées par l'ensemble du public. Nous avons le plaisir de vous écouter pour cette deuxième intervention de la matinée.
So I start my talk with the title, The Circularity of the Embodied Mind. And now from an embodied and inactive point of view, the mind is not regarded as a disembodied internal representation of the world, nor is it a system of brain modules and algorithms that allow to calculate and predict the world. On the contrary, it is an embodied mind that always integrates the present state of the whole organism interacting with the world. And it is a bodily subject whose experience extends over the body and which, via its mediation, is in direct contact with the world. So this implies two connected claims. First, it is not the brain alone that is constitutive for subjective experience. Much rather, it is the system of brain and peripheral body continuously interacting with each other. And second, the subject actually inhabits the body. So I'm spatially extended, coextensive with my physical body, and its movements are literally my movements. In other words, the body is not the mere vehicle, but the very source and medium of my relation to the world. If we, in this way, reconceptualize the disembodied mind, then the mind-body problem has to be recast. It is no longer a question of how the mind is related to the brain, but how the lived or subject body and the living or object body are related to each other. Or in short, it becomes the body-body problem, as Evan Thompson has termed it. And a particular challenging aspect of this problem is the question how we may attribute a more than epiphenomenal role to subjective embodiment. Now, in my talk, I want to address this problem from several sides. First, I will present the concept of a dual aspect of the living being as subject body and object body. And then I will use the concept of circularity to describe the relation of both aspects. I will try to show that circularity characterizes the structure of embodiment, that circular causality characterizes the part-whole relation of the organism, and that circularity of process and structure characterizes the development of the organism and the living being over time. And this will finally lead to a proposal on how this development may be increasingly determined by the embodied subject itself as self-formation. Now, to start with, cognitive neuroscience is still based on the principal divide between the mental and the physical, or between the subjective mind and the objective body. The one only accessible from within, from the so-called first-person perspective, the other only accessible from without, from a third-person perspective. Now, what is lost in this principal divide is the human person, which essentially means a living being, an embodied subject interacting with others from a second-person perspective. So the brain is primarily an organ of the living being, and only by this becomes an organ of the mind. For both life and mind are essentially related to what is beyond them, dependent on the continuous exchange with their environment. So consciousness is not a localizable object or state at all, but it is a process of relating to and interacting with the environment. So it is something that we live and enact. And on this condition, the living organism, the living being in the center, is the primary entity. So the common denominator of the mental and the physical, so to speak. And the life acts of the living being may then be regarded on the one hand as integral, bodily, emotional, intellectual acts, experienced from the first but also from the second person perspective. On the other hand, from the right side, the life acts may be considered and investigated from a third person perspective, namely as physiological processes in any degree of detail. So the living being appears on the two aspects. On the one hand, as a lived body, a subject body. On the other hand, as a living, organic body, body as object. Now, instead of a gap between two radically different ontologies, we are now faced with the duality of aspects within embodiment. And the question now is about the relation between one's body as subjectively lived and one's body as a living organism. And the answer must be that processes of living and processes of experience, in German Leben and Erleben, are both aspects of the life process seen from two complementary points of view. In French, we also have vivre et vivre quelque chose, so le vécu. So that's also the connection that is important here. Of course, this dual aspectivity corresponds to a cross-sectional view. If we change to a diachronic perspective, enactivism proposes the life-mind continuity thesis, according to which living beings are always minded beings. But in higher living beings, the organizational structure of the living, of the autopoietic system, gives also rise to processes of experience, which in turn modify and change the organic structure. I will come back to this later on. Now, a first consequence from this is that for grasping the embodied mind, we have to extend the narrow focus of neuroscience on the brain. We have to zoom out, so to speak. And this is the reason why I emphasized the second person perspective before. For it reminds us that only the living being as a whole may be regarded as the proper subject of feeling, thinking, speaking, etc. And accordingly, it is only through interacting with others in an empathic mode and within the common life world that we have access to the embodied mind at all. There is a fine observation by the 18th century German philosopher Lichtenberg when confronted with contemporary attempts to localize the soul in the brain. I quote, "If in beholding an object I take a step forward, I come nearer to it, how minimal this may be. However, it is quite different with the organ of the soul. And it might well be possible that by an all too near approximation, as with the microscope, one removes oneself from what can be approached." So this means neural activations and circumscribed brain structures are not the adequate scale to look for the basis of the mind. Because below a certain distance, the mind just disappears. And therefore, zooming in, getting closer and closer, means a shift, namely from what Husserl called the personalistic to a naturalistic attitude, from being a participant to being an observer, or from the second to the third person perspective. On a daily basis, a doctor undergoes this change in attitudes For instance, when greeting a patient like this one and seeing his friendly or anxious or similar gaze, yet shortly afterwards taking hold of the ophthalmoscope to examine the patient's eyes as physical organs. And at this point, looking at them from too close a distance, the gaze obviously has vanished. The doctor may even get still closer and investigate the retina. Just like the physiologist or the neuroscientist may explore all the microstructures and microprocesses in the head, down to the occipital lobe, or for example, to the microstructure of the neurons in the occipital lobe. But nowhere will consciousness, mind, or life show themselves, for they are macro phenomena that are only accessible in coexistence from the second person perspective. Nevertheless, both attitudes are directed to the same entity, that is, the living being or the living person. The lived or subjective body as the location of sensations and affections, the body as a medium of the enactment of life. None of these emerges as a construct in the brain. Rather, this lived body is the organism itself, under the aspect of its holistic aliveness, that is manifested both subjectively as well as intersubjectively. Therefore, taking an inactive approach implies zooming out, both with regard to place and time, looking at the wider system and how it develops over time. And then one can see that physiological processes and experiential processes, the lived and the physical body, are belonging to a more encompassing system, namely the system of the living being and its environment, or of the person and her world, an ecological system that is in continuous development. Now, these wider systems are fundamentally characterized by the principle of circularity, which I will address now in more detail in order to approach the body-body problem. To begin with, two interactive cycles are the basis of the embodied mind: homeostatic cycles between brain and body, and sensorimotor cycles between brain, body, and environment. Looking first at the cycles between brain and body, we have to look at affective neuroscience, where we find that it is the continuous circular interaction of brain and body which is the basis of a primary background feeling of being alive, a pre-reflective self-awareness. So according to Antonio Damasio or Jacques Panczak, multiple interoceptive signals from the whole body are integrated by centers in the brainstem, diencephalon and hypothalamus, and thus serve the regulation of the inner milieu, homeostasis. Brain and body influence each other in constant circular feedback, providing the basis for a unified bodily self-awareness which lends a sense of mindness to all our experience. It is obvious from more specific feelings such as freshness and vigor, or tiredness and exhaustion, that this background feeling of the deep body is spatially extended, although not precisely circumscribed. And correspondingly, its biological basis is the present state of the organism as a whole. And here, processes of life and processes of experience are inseparably bound to each other. The same, of course, applies to the more specific and intentional emotions. They are also connected to changes in the body landscape of various kinds. And Damasio writes, I quote, "Emotions constitute a looped circuit where the body communicates to the central nervous system and the latter responds to the body's messages. And the signals are not separable from the organism states where they originate. The ensemble constitutes a dynamic bonded unit." So there is no separation possible between brain and environment when we feel emotions. On the next level, the sensorimotor cycles between brain, body, and environment, we find the core of the inactive approach, and I need not go into detail here. Embodied subjectivity doesn't stop at the boundaries of the skin. It is extended as being towards the world, mediated by the habitual functioning of the lived body. And this is mirrored on the biological level by the structural coupling of organism and environment, produced in particular through circular action perception loops. They are certainly based on suitable brain networks as well, but the brain functions rather as a mediating organ. The carrier processes which are necessary for conscious experience extend into the environment, to the objects that we perceive and grasp. And therefore, consciousness may not be localized in any one place at all. It is the integral, so to speak, of the ongoing interactions between brain, body, and environment. So as we can see, from an embodied approach, the phenomenology of bodily being in the world corresponds to the ecology of the organism in its environment. They are both complementary aspects of the same life process that connects the living subject and the world, or brain, body, and environment, in circular interactions. Circularity and thus constitutes a higher level concept, which corresponds to the macro level of the organism, and which may not be reduced to physiological microprocesses. However, in order to further establish its significance, it still has to be complemented by the concept of circular causality, namely a causality or a relation between higher and lower level system, between higher and lower system levels of the organism, between the macro level and the micro level, or between the whole and its parts. Thus, a living being may be regarded as a system that continuously reproduces the components of which it itself consists, the organs, the cells, etc., while these components reciprocally sustain and regenerate the system as a whole. So the whole is the condition for the existence and functions of the parts by which it is in turn realized. This leads to a structure which may be termed a downward and upward structure, with a whole to part causality on the one hand and a part to whole causality on the other hand. Such a structure, for instance, characterizes the relations between genes and the organism as a whole. The genetic structure of an individual cell nucleus controls the necessary production of specialized cellular organs and functions. This would be upward causality, local to global. But conversely, the configuration and function of the entire organism determines which genes are even given relevance for the development and specialization of a certain individual cell. And this means downward causality, global to local causality. Circular causality also characterizes the functions of the brain. For example, an emotional state, such as a patient's anxiety, can be treated pharmacologically by directly influencing the transmitter metabolism in the single neurons in the brain. That would mean an upward influence. On the other hand, the same result can also be achieved by a calming talk with a psychotherapist, for example. That means on the higher level of social interaction. This level changes the patient's perception of his situation, but also the metabolism of his brain. As such, intersubjectivity corresponds to an integral level of organism-environment interactions that feeds back into lower-level physiological processes. Now, this type of causality is often criticized and rejected, arguing that it either presupposes unknown physical forces and thus contradicts the laws of physics, or that it is just superfluous and falls prey to Occam's razor. However, it is by no means necessary that we restrict the notion of causality to effective causes, according to billiard balls acting on each other. Macrostructures may well develop forming and organizing effects with regard to the micro elements in which they are realized. And this would be in accordance with another causality, namely with a causa formalis in Aristotle's sense. And this doesn't mean that new forces emerge which would contradict physical laws. Macrostructures are rather in a position, thanks to their form and configuration, to select specific properties and behaviors of their components and to block others. Such selecting emergent properties may be illustrated by the example of hemoglobin and iron. Normally, iron, which is exposed to oxygen and humidity, oxidizes. It rusts because it binds oxygen irreversibly. Now, for the whole process of respiration within the organism, it is decisive that the iron is forced to do something that it would never do under normal circumstances, namely to incorporate and bind oxygen reversibly. And this crucial purpose is served by hemoglobin, a macromolecule consisting of about 10,000 atoms, with the sole purpose to enable iron to release its oxygen again in the necessary areas of the organism. For this, there are special regions of the molecule, the so-called heme regions, the heme group, which incorporates iron, as you see it on the right side, in a special way so that it can bind oxygen reversibly. So no physical miracle is required to accomplish this, but only a higher order structure which enslaves its own constitutive elements and involves them in specific patterns of behavior. Generally, the molecular processes within a living cell are designed so as to produce chemical reactions and molecules in a way that their composition occurs a billion times more likely than in non-organic environments. That's the principle of cell metabolism. But analogously, mental processes, as embodied and integral acts of a living organism, can also be effective in the organism's physical behavior. Of course, the mental aspect doesn't affect physiological processes as an external force. It rather exerts a top-down, a formative influence over them. If I, for example, speak a sentence like I'm doing now, then the muscles of my tongue and larynx display certain organized patterns of movement. And their efficient cause is the release of acetylcholine at the motor end plates. This would mean an upward causality. Nevertheless, it is equally correct to say that my tongue and larynx move in these ways because I am now speaking these words, and I'm intentionally directed towards their content. Now this because, however, no longer signifies an efficient cause, but a higher order selecting a forming cause. So the muscles are always ready for excitation. They could contract in manifold other ways, but they are now drawn into a selective, superordinate dynamics. And thus the organizing cause of the muscle actions is my speaking downward, which in turn is realized by a complex dynamics of physiological mechanisms upward. However, the same applies to the neuronal activity in motor and other areas of my brain right now. They proceed in this precise way because I'm speaking these words, consciously spanning the intentional arc of the sentence over time, roughly anticipating the meaning of the sentence and protensions on the next words to come. So in other words, my embodied intentions and protensions, anticipations, are able to organize their physical implementation so as to achieve a future state that does not yet exist. As overarching enactments of life, conscious processes may thus be effective in the behavior of a living being without acting on brain processes externally. And in order to avoid any connotation of such an efficient cause, one could also speak of an implicational causality. So by way of thinking or speaking, I, as a living being, also realize certain organized processes in which ordered neuronal and muscular activities are implied. They cannot help, as it were, similar to water molecules being drawn into a whirl that nevertheless consists of them. The whirl as form or order implies their specific movements without acting upon them. And thus the complete cause of my speaking is neither my tongue nor my brain, but I am this cause myself as a living being. And in each conscious action, walking, speaking, writing, or thinking, the living being as a whole acts as the forming, selecting, and organizing cause. Again, circular causality does not mean reciprocal causation or an interaction between mind and body, but a relation of implication, or global to local encompassing. So there is no external causal relation between the experiential and the neurophysiological descriptions, because they pertain to one and the same process, looked at with a wider or a narrower focus. So when I get anxious in a certain frightening situation, for example, there is no causal impact from my brain activity to my experience, or the other way around. My having this experience in this situation encompasses or implies certain brain activities by way of circular causality or implication. And having such an experience of anxiety is for its part dependent upon my being that person with a specific history and being related to this specific situation. Both the experience and the neurophysiological processes are part of the complex system of a person coupled to her environment. The person and as a living being embodies and encompasses both aspects. Now, circular causality alone doesn't suffice, however, in particular when it comes to the development of the living being or of the human person. What I propose here is a concept that leads from circularity to spirality. Let me explain this. What I propose is, at first, a continuous incorporation of experience into the body and its habits, its skills, into body memory, in other words. And this is in a sense which was hinted at by Merleau-Ponty. The body is solidified or generalized existence, and existence a perpetual incarnation. I will try and spell this out as a circularity of living process and solidified structure. A circularity which in the diachronic view may then be rather conceived as a spirality, so to speak. Based on research into neuroplasticity, we can say that each bodily experience or behavior above induces changes in the highly plastic neuronal matrix of the brain below. So changes in synaptic structure of networks, in the connectivity strength between brain regions, mediated by epigenetic alterations of cellular functions, and resulting in more adaptive dispositions and patterns of neural activity. Now, all this, conversely, this sedimentation of experience, in turn leads to a modified experience and behavior. So we have a downward and an upward direction of causality, but now in a historical dimension. In other words, there's a continuous circularity between experiential process and organic structure, or in other words, between lived and physical body. Over time, experiences are sedimented in what may be termed body memory, namely the totality of habits, skills, interactive schemes, and dispositions that are characteristic of an individual. Of course, it is not as if there are two separate processes going on, one experiential and one physiological. Rather, we are looking at two aspects of one and the same process. The one implying the lived moment-to-moment interaction within the wider system of organism and environment, and the other having a narrower focus on the physiological processes and the continuous organization of structure, which turns existence or process into organic structure. So there's circular causality, downward influencing and upward enabling relations, but there's again no causal interaction between the aspects. Looked at diachronically, and thus more precisely, this results in a spiral-shaped development. Lived body or process on the left side, and organic body or structure mutually influence and modify each other. Structure on the right side. Interactive experiences become organic dispositions, which in turn enable new forms of experience. So this relation of Leib and Körper, of lived and physical body, unfolds in time and becomes the dynamics of process and structure mutually turning into each other, which is precisely what we call learning and development. An impressive example of such a circular causality is found in an experiment of the neuroscientist Miranka Sir and his group. They were able to induce a major cortical reorganization in newborn ferrets, which are blind at first. Now, Sir and his group cut through one of their optical nerves. They connected it with the auditory pathways to the cortex, and afterwards they let the ferrets move around. And now visual stimuli, independent on their motor activity, reached a brain region which normally processes acoustic signals. Surprisingly, the brain adapted to the new sensorimotor patterns produced by the superordinate organism-environment interaction. And gradually, the acoustic brain center turned into a visual center, so that the ferrets were finally able to see with the eye normally. And what we can learn from this is the principle form follows function. Interacting with the environment induces the brain to develop precisely the structures necessary for its adequate perception. For ever smoother interaction, in other words. Of course, similar cortical reorganizations can also be observed in humans, for example, after brain lesions or injuries, where patients can relearn major skills just by continuous practice. Again, interactions create the corresponding brain structures. And this circularity was already recognized long before the age of neuroscience by the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. I quote, "Only through thinking is the brain formed as an organ of thought and adapted to thinking. It is modified and determined through the habit of thinking this or that, one way or the other. But only through the fully shaped organ of thought, thinking itself becomes erudite, skilled, secure. So what was effect becomes cause and vice versa." Of course, we have to consider this development, this learning of thinking, not as an individual development. Thinking is essentially dependent on language acquisition, which in turn is scaffolded by situations of intercorporeality in early childhood, situations of shared attention, joint practice, which lead again to through neuroplasticity to the corresponding dispositions. So the social environment becomes the crucial ontogenetic niche for scaffolding the infant's neural development. And in the course of this development, customs, habits, and cultural techniques are acquired by interaction and cooperative learning. So the embodied mind is intersubjectively formed from birth on. To use a somewhat bold comparison, we could even say that the social and cultural environment provide the scaffolding for the development of the embodied mind in a way similar to hemoglobin providing the scaffolding for iron to behave in a particular flexible way. In both cases, we have a higher order system that structures, orders, selects, and constrains the possibilities of the agents on the lower level. To give just one example for that, as is well known, babies have a universal potentiality for speech and articulation at first, which through acquiring the mother tongue is gradually restricted to a culture-bound pattern. And therefore, in the first months of life, babies can still distinguish more phonemes than the adults of their culture. The plastic matrix of their brains is now shaped and structured through the higher order patterns of their social linguistic interactions. Of course, this is just one example of the spirality of process and structure that extends over the whole childhood development and continues later on, as the constant sedimentation of experience, or what Merleau-Ponty called the perpetual incarnation of existence. I skipped 2 slides here. Now, a final level is important. All processes of circularity that I mentioned so far were involuntary, so to speak. Learning, habit, and skill formation were the byproduct of interactions just going on in the course of living. But it is characteristic of our species that we increasingly take ownership and responsibility for this development ourselves. We choose our own development and we educate and cultivate ourselves more and more deliberately. That is learning and self-formation. This was nicely expressed by Goethe. I quote, Animals are taught by their organs, said the ancient. I add humans as well, yet they have the advantage of teaching their organs in turn. And this means that the spiral of process and structure is modified and directed to a certain goal deliberately. By their decisions and actions, by choosing a certain way of life and environment, human persons shape their own development. For this way of life and this environment feeds back on their own becoming. So humans do not only live, but they lead their lives, and through this, they form themselves. And this new level of freedom creates a particular human circularity, including one's moral development, which we find uniquely expressed in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I quote, "The virtues we get by first exercising them, as also happens in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, or lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. For it is activities exercised on particular objects that make the corresponding character." This was my final quotation. Note the apparent contradiction again that is due to the circularity. The things we learn by doing them before we can do them. Now to conclude, in my talk, I have investigated the interrelation of lived or subject body on the one hand, and physiological or object body on the other hand, as a dual aspect of the living being. In particular, I have interpreted the intertwinement of both ways of the body on the basis of circularity. First, embodiment shows a circular structure as it is based on the cycles of homeostatic self-regulation between brain and body, and on the sensorimotor cycles between brain, body, and environment. But the circularity goes further. In order to establish the effectiveness of embodied subjectivity, I've used the concept of circular causality, characterizing the relation of parts and wholes within the living organism and within the organism-environment system. Downward causation enables an account of embodied subjectivity as an ordering or forming cause of a living being's actions, while it avoids dualistic assumptions of the mind somehow acting on the body. So it enables attributing a crucial and not only epiphenomenal role to the integral level of the body as subject and to intercorporeality. It is a causation by global to local implication, not a separate mental activity or impact. And as a next step, I've described the interrelation of lived and physical body as a circularity between experiential process and neurophysiological structure which underlies development and learning. And here, the circular causality of higher and lower level processes is considered in the diachronic dimension, based on the plasticity, in particular, of the brain. Subjective and intersubjective processes and experiences constitute a process of sense-making that entrains cerebral processes so as to form modified neuronal structures, which in turn enable altered future interactions. And this results in a spiral-shaped development. Lived body and organic body mutually influence and modify each other. And this is not only an individual development. The social and cultural environment constitute the crucial ontogenetic niche for the individual formation of the brain. And analogously, human culture has also provided the decisive scaffolding for the phylogenetic evolution of organic, in particular brain structures of the human being. A final step is reached with the possibility of shaping one's own development, which arises with the relation to oneself and the autonomy of the human person. This is the circularity of freedom. By choosing one's actions and way of life, one also shapes the body's dispositions, skills, and habits, which increasingly enable those actions. So individuals are not just the result of the organic, social, and cultural conditions which have contributed to their development. Rather, they take responsibility of their own becoming by choosing the experiences, actions, and situations which feed back into their development. And this self-determination is based on circular causality as well, as a presupposition of free decisions and actions, and on the human capacity of taking a stance towards one's own being and becoming. In this way, in sum, circularity may be a suitable concept to approach a solution to the body-body problem I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you very much for your attention.